If you've stepped into a new role or you're operating in an environment where things are moving faster, stakes are higher, and expectations are increasing, you've likely noticed something. In some moments, you're exactly where you expect to be: clear, decisive, effective. And in other moments, something shifts. You hesitate, you overthink, you feel less certain than you should. Not because you don't know what to do, but because you're not accessing it in the same way. That gap becomes more visible in new environments because there's more uncertainty, responsibility, and pressure. So what used to feel automatic now requires effort. And that's where most people start to question themselves. But this is not about confidence, and it's not about capability. It's about something much more specific. So as we go through this, you'll be able to map it directly to your own experience, if it's there. And if not, this won't be relevant. Before we get into the model, I want to frame how to listen to this. If you hear this through the wrong channel, it'll sound like something you've heard before. There are three things to keep in mind. First, performance is state dependent. The issue is not what you know, it's what you can access in the moment. Your capability doesn't disappear under pressure, but your access to it can. This is why you can have two moments close together, where in one, you're clear, decisive, effective, and in the other, you hesitate, overthink, or react. Same person, same knowledge, different access. Second, movement between states is fast, but where you stay becomes habit. You can move between high performance and low performance in seconds, but repeated time in a state becomes your default. What starts as a moment becomes a pattern. What becomes a pattern becomes your style, and that starts to look like your personality. Third, what feels like personality is often conditioning. Most people believe they are reacting based on who they are. In reality, they're reacting based on patterns that have been reinforced over time. Those patterns can be changed, but they're not changed by thinking differently once. They're changed by intervening at the level where they are formed. So as we go through this, don't think about this as information. Think about it as something you can map directly to your own experience, because once you see it, you'll recognize it immediately. And once you recognize it, you can begin to influence it. Now, up to this point, this may sound like something that happens occasionally. A moment here, maybe a moment there. That's not actually what's going on, because these moments don't stay isolated. They accumulate. Every time you drop from clarity into hesitation, every time you react instead of direct, if you lose access for even a few seconds, it doesn't just affect that moment. It affects the decision, the way you communicate the decision, even the way other people respond, and in turn, what happens next. So performance becomes inconsistent at the moment level and compounds at the life level. Over time, that inconsistency starts to look like a leadership style, a pattern others adapt to, or in some cases, a limitation, not because that's your capability, but because that's what shows up often enough to define you. That's the real cost. And the reason most people don't address it is simple. They don't have a way to see it clearly. They experience it, they feel it, but they don't have language for it. So they default to explanations like pressure, personality, confidence, experience, maybe even identity. But those don't actually explain the pattern. What does explain it is structure. And that's what I'm going to show you now. The model I'm going to walk you through is called the 5 levels of personal leadership. It's simple on the surface, but it explains something most people experience and don't have language for. At the center is stabilized. This is where most people operate when things are normal. You're functional, you're capable, you're getting your work done. You're not at your peak, but you're operating effectively enough. Below that is destabilized. This is where reactivity begins. You're still functioning, but something has changed. Your attention starts to narrow. Your thinking becomes less flexible. You start reacting to what's happening instead of directing it. You may feel pressure, urgency, or uncertainty. Below that is collapse. This is where performance breaks down. At this level, you're no longer responding to reality. You're reacting to your own internal reactions. Thoughts loop. Options disappear. Clarity drops significantly. This is what people often describe as spiraling or freezing, shutting down. Now, above stabilized is agency. This is where performance becomes intentional. You're directing your attention, you're applying what you know, and being proactive, making decisions with clarity. You're not just responding, you're leading your own thinking. Let that sink in. Leading your own thinking. It's the difference between responding and reacting. Above that is expansion. This is peak performance. This is where output increases, clarity sharpens, and execution accelerates. People often describe this as being in the zone. Now, here's the key point. You don't live in one of these levels. You move between them throughout the day, across situations, often without realizing it. And over time, where you spend the most time determines your results, not just in individual moments, but across your career. If you spend more time in destabilized or collapsed, your performance becomes inconsistent. If you spend more time in agency, your performance becomes reliable. If you access expansion more frequently, your performance compounds on an upward trajectory. So the question is not what level am I in? The question is how often do I move between these levels and how quickly can I recover? Because that determines everything. Let's look at what actually pulls people down. The shift from stabilized to destabilized, usually it's triggered by a few consistent conditions: time pressure, ambiguity, social or status threat, cognitive overload. You've experienced all of these. A deadline moves up unexpectedly. Information is incomplete, but a decision is still required. Someone challenges your judgment, or there's simply too much coming at once. Each of these consumes attention. Each of these reduces bandwidth. And when bandwidth drops, performance follows. If that continues, you move from destabilized into collapse. And this is where things change, because now you're no longer responding or even reacting to the actual situation. You're reacting to your reaction to the situation. Internal looping starts. One thought becomes five. Five become 10. And each one becomes more negative, more urgent, more certain. At that point, your system is no longer processing reality. It's processing an internally generated stimulus, and performance drops quickly. This is why you can have a situation that objectively is manageable, but internally feels overwhelming, because the system has shifted. To understand why this happens, we need to shift how we think about how the brain works. Most people think in terms of the subconscious mind. That framing is not useful. A more accurate way to think about this is as a network of neurons. You have billions of neurons, each connected to thousands of others, trillions of connections. These connections form pathways, and those pathways are strengthened through repetition. The more a pathway is used, the more it becomes the path of least resistance. That's what we call a habit. Now that's where this becomes important. When a stimulus occurs or something happens in your environment, your brain processes that information extremely quickly, not at the level of conscious thought, at the level of neural activity. Think energy pulsing across neurons. That system is processing millions of bits of information per second. Your conscious mind processes a very small fraction of that. So by the time you become aware of something, most of the work has already been done. Meaning has already been assigned. A reaction has already been formed. And what gets handed to your conscious mind feels like truth. But it's not necessarily truth. It's an association. It's based on past experiences and your internal interpretation of those experiences, patterns that were formed over time, many of them early in life. So when you react, you're not reacting to reality in that moment. You're reacting to what your neural pathways have associated with that situation. This is why two people can experience the same exact situation and respond completely differently. It's not the situation. It's a pattern associated with the situation. This is also why common approaches like affirmations or visualization, they don't consistently work. Now they can work, but only under certain conditions. If the gap between the new idea and your existing pattern is small, they can reinforce your desired outcome. But if there are strong competing patterns, those patterns will likely dominate. The same applies to willpower and discipline. Willpower relies on your conscious mind, which is limited. It fatigues, and it operates much slower than the neural system. So when pressure increases, willpower decreases. and you revert to your strongest patterns. This is not a failure of effort. It's a mismatch between where you're trying to make the change and where the behavior is actually coming from. If the behavior is coming from neural pathways, the change has to occur at that level. That's what neuroplasticity actually means. It works because those pathways can change, but they change through repetition and conditioning, helped along with intensity. That's how they were formed, not through a single insight. Now, let's talk about timing. Timing is where the leverage is. From the moment a stimulus occurs to the moment you respond consciously, roughly a second passes. Within that 1 second, the first 600 milliseconds are critical, the first 6/10 of a second. During that time, your brain is detecting the stimulus, assigning meaning, forming a reaction. This all happens before you are consciously aware of it. You can think of it in 3 parts. The first segment is initial detection. Something happens, and your system registers it. The second segment is rapid appraisal. Your brain determines what it means, but it does this using past associations, not current reality. This is where cognitive biases come into play. The third segment is reaction formation. Your system prepares a reaction, which it suggests as a response, which gets handed to your conscious mind. By the time you're aware, the trajectory is already set. Now, here's the important part of all this. The earlier you can intervene in that process, the easier it is to change it. In the earliest phase, it takes very little effort to shift attention. As you move later in the sequence, it takes more effort and produces less impact. This is why most people struggle. They try to change their behavior after the reaction is fully formed. At that point, they're working against momentum. This is also why techniques like take a deep breath sometimes work and sometimes don't. If you catch it early, they can be effective. If you catch it late, they're much less effective. So the goal is not just to respond better, it's to detect earlier and intervene earlier. But these have to be conditioned like habits because they happen prior to conscious awareness. In short, earlier detection gives you more control and impact with less effort. Now, let's look at the other side of this because you've also experienced moments where none of that is happening. Moments where, despite the complexity, you're clear. You're able to see the situation accurately. You're able to make decisions without hesitation. You're able to communicate in a way that aligns people, and you're able to do it without feeling like you're forcing it. That's not random. That's a different operating state. In those moments, you have access to what you know, access to your experience, access to your judgment. You're not stuck in one interpretation. You can see multiple paths. You can prioritize effectively. You can adapt in real time. And in a growing company, in a rapidly changing environment, that matters more than almost anything else because growth introduces variability. Things change quickly, roles evolve, decisions have second and third order effects. So the ability to operate with clarity under those conditions becomes a multiplier. Now, take that one step further. If you increase the amount of time you spend in that state and reduce the amount of time you spend in the lower states, the difference is not incremental. It compounds exponentially. You make better decisions more consistently. You communicate more clearly. You build trust faster. You establish credibility earlier. And importantly, you conserve energy because instead of fighting the situation, you're working with it. This is especially critical in your first 90 days in a new role or after a promotion because that period is not just about learning. It's about trajectory. The patterns you establish early tend to persist. Most people have experienced that, but don't know why. So if your experience is reactive, inconsistent, high effort, that tends to carry forward. If your experience is clear, adaptive, controlled, that becomes your baseline. The goal then is not perfection. The goal is increasing time in the states where you can operate effectively and reducing time in the states where you can't. And that's something that can not only be influenced, it can be directed. If you've been trying to get better at this, you've probably already gone down a few paths. You've read about leadership frameworks, you've worked on mindset, you've tried to be more intentional, more disciplined, more focused, and in some situations, those things help, but not consistently, especially not under pressure. And that's the part most people don't question. They assume the issue is, I need more time, I need more experience. I need to get more comfortable. But if you look closely, something else is happening. You already have the knowledge. You already understand what good leadership looks like. You already know how you should respond. But in the moment, you don't always execute that way. That gap, the one between knowing and doing, is where most people get stuck. And the reason they get stuck is because they're trying to solve it at the wrong level. Most of what's taught in leadership development is built around frameworks, communication models, strategic thinking. Those are useful, even necessary, especially as you scale, but they operate at the level of conscious thought. The problem you're dealing with is not primarily happening there. It's happening earlier. It's happening in how situations are interpreted before you're aware of it. That means when you try to apply a framework after your reaction is already formed, you're working against serious momentum. And that's why it feels inconsistent. The same applies to things like mindset work or positive thinking. They can help in low pressure environments, but in high pressure environments, like stepping into a new role in a company that's scaling, in a rapidly changing environment, they don't hold up reliably. Because under pressure, your system doesn't default to your intentions, it defaults to your conditioning. And that's the part most people never address directly. They try to layer new ideas on top of old patterns instead of changing the patterns themselves. So effort increases, awareness increases, but results don't change, not proportionally. And over time, that leads to frustration because it feels like I know what to do. Why am I not doing it consistently? Or I've tried everything. It's not a motivation problem. It's not a discipline problem. It's a mismatch between where the behavior is coming from and where you're attempting to change it. Until that mismatch is resolved, progress will be uneven. So if performance is driven by patterns, and those patterns are formed through repeated stimulus, reaction, response cycles, then the question becomes, how do you intervene in those cycles? That's what the 7-step reset is designed to do. At a high level, you go through tens of thousands of these cycles every day. Most of them happen automatically, unconsciously. The 7-step reset is a way to bring awareness and control into selected cycles. Not all of them, but enough to begin shifting patterns. It focuses on 3 things. First, detecting the moment earlier. Second, interrupting the automatic reaction with the same automaticity the system is in. And third, constructing a more effective, conditioned reaction, which leads to a more effective response. And then returning to a neutral state so the next cycle is not influenced by the previous one where you may have experienced some stress. This begins to change the underlying pathways faster than one would think. What used to be automatic and seemingly working against your interests becomes less dominant. What you practice becomes more accessible, and this is not something that happens instantly. It happens through repetition. But when done correctly, it becomes automatic, just like the behavior you've been trying to stop. And that's the goal, not to think your way through every situation, but to change what happens automatically so that your default responses are aligned with how you want to perform. Now, if you step back and look at everything we've covered, there are a few things that become clear. Performance is not fixed. It changes based on the state you're in. Those states shift quickly, often before you're aware of it. And over time, where you spend the most time becomes your default, which means your results are not just driven by what you know. They're driven by how consistently you can access what you know, especially under pressure. Understanding that is useful, but it doesn't solve the problem because the issue is not awareness or lack of insight. The issue is conditioning, and conditioning does not change through a single insight. It changes through structured repetition, duration, intensity. It changes by working at the level where the pattern is formed and doing it consistently enough that a new pattern becomes the path of least resistance. That's why this is not something most people can solve on their own. Not because they're not capable, but because the system they're trying to change is the same system evaluating whether the change is working. So it defaults back to what's familiar. That's where structure matters. The next step is not information, it's application. In a structured environment where you can recognize these shifts in real time, interrupt the pattern earlier, and begin to experience what it feels like to operate with access consistently. And that's where the shift starts. Because once you experience the difference, even briefly, you have a reference point. And from there, it becomes something you can build upon and expand. Look at this in the context of your role, your environment, and where this shows up. Specifically, I do a small number of one-on-one short diagnostic calls. We map what's happening, where the constraint is, and whether there's a clear path to shift it. If there is, I'll show you how I'd approach it. If not, you'll leave with some clarity. You can choose using the accompanying link, and I'll see you on the other side.